Welcome back to SaharaTV viewers. On this segment, we're going to be discussing the work of Felix Morka. He is Executive Director of the Social and Economics Right Action Center, SaharaTV, in Nigeria, in Lagos specifically. He has been doing work on defending the urban slum dwellers of Lagos, specifically against forced evictions and demolition of their communities. He has been a Harvard-trained lawyer and has been at this work for quite some time. Thank you, Mr. Morka, for joining us here on SaharaTV.
Thank you, David.
So if we could start out, this instance of forced evictions and demolition of these poor communities has been going on for a while in Nigeria. Even back, there's cases of towns and communities in Lagos into the 1990s. One, Morocco, in the 1990s was leveled and the land was sold off. Now, I know it's not just Lagos. You have also talked about cases in Abuja and other states across Nigeria where these forced evictions and demolitions have occurred. Now, if you could just tell us in a brief word how long you've been working on this and what you've seen over the years. Have things gotten worse or have they stayed mostly the same?
Well, thank you very much. I am the founder and the executive director of SaharaTV, the Social and Economic Rights Action Center. SaharaTV was founded in 1995, so we've been around for about 18 years. And in all of that time, we've been
Excuse me, sir. Go ahead.
Mostly in Port Harcourt, in Lagos, as well as in Abuja, but also in some other cities around the country. Now, SaharaTV's work entails really the promotion and protection of economic, social, and cultural rights. Rights that include the right to adequate housing, for example, the right to an adequate standard of living, the right to health, and rights that come within that rubric of social and economic rights. Our work entails essentially providing education, creating awareness within these urban poor communities, making them understand that they have certain rights that are guaranteed by law, right to have a place to live, right to have access to decent shelter and to functional neighborhoods. Now, unfortunately, over the years, many of these communities have been unfairly targeted by all levels of government for demolition. Now, what is disturbing about this pattern that we have witnessed this past 18 years is really the impunity of government action, the fact that many of these communities do not get the benefit of warning that these actions are about to take place. They are never consulted. The notice that they get is often very inadequate. And in many cases, these things are done without any kind of remedy. No compensation is paid, no resettlement is given, no alternative is provided at all. And quite often, these are people who are already desperately in poverty. So when the government invades their communities and trashes their homes, you find that things get worse. Our families are broken. Children are unable to continue their education. Social networks are completely disrupted. So the consequences of this sort of actions are just enormous. You mentioned in 1990 that a sprawling slum called Morocco was demolished just with barely 7 days notice announced over the radio. Now, think back. This was 1990, at a time when many people didn't have radio, had no access to any kind of information. So only a few people heard that announcement. I was a young lawyer at the Civil Liberties Organization, Nigeria's premier human rights organization, during that period. And I was involved in an effort that tried to stop that demolition. But you know what? It took the conniving Chief Judge of Lagos State, Mr. Migali Ayorinde of blessed memory, to defeat the CLO's effort at getting a court injunction to stop that demolition. Now, the result is that Morocco was demolished, 300,000 people were made homeless. As I speak to you, over nearly 23 years on, over 75% of the former house owners still remain without shelter. And that was the watershed. And since then, it's been, it's continued. Governments plan these demolitions without warning, and they implement it, not because they want to execute any projects that are of, the public interest. Quite often, the projects that replace or that take over the land from which these people are evicted are often projects that are really not have no public value whatsoever. In many cases, these things are turned over to private developers to build estates and to build businesses that benefit just a few people and perhaps some officials who have made it possible for them to gain access.
Yes, sir. Yeah, just one moment. I'm actually very glad you mentioned that about the fact that they're turned over for commercialization interests to very few private hands. In fact, in the case of Lagos, we have here that some of this has been initiated by the World Bank, what they call the Lagos Management Development Project, of which its founding documents claim that they identified 9 blighted communities across Lagos, which were supposedly to address the deplorable conditions and, in fact, upgrade infrastructure, including roads and drainage and waste disposal, and provide health care and further develop education for the people living there. Now, obviously, you just mentioned that, in fact, the people in Morocco and across these communities where they have been demolished have in fact gotten worse. So obviously there is no standing behind what these founding documents said. Now, on that point, I'm just curious if you know about the money, if there was any money given to the Lagos state government by the World Bank or by other organizations for the proposed rehabilitation of these communities, and in fact what has happened to that money now that really these communities have changed hands into private buyers.
Well, yes, the project you are referring to is called the Lagos Metropolitan Development and Governance Project, the LMDGP. Now, this is a project that is financed by the World Bank with a $200 million facility to the Lagos state government. The project began in 2007 and is actually scheduled to close this year, even though the Lagos state government is seeking an extension of about 18 months to enable it to complete that project. Now, until July last year, when Makoko, another large slum, the Makoko waterfront community, came under the hammer of the Lagos state government, came under an effort to demolish that community. I was actually a member of the board of that World Bank project. I was appointed to that board in 2007 by the former governor because of my representation of many of these communities that are affected by the project itself, including the 9 that you mentioned. That were the direct targets for improvement, for investments or another project. Now, I can tell you without any fear of contradiction that the project itself was, well conceived. Obviously, it was intended to benefit the people who live in these communities, to provide, more roads and improve some of the schools, build, more primary healthcare centers, provide boreholes and things like that, which are things that are badly needed in these communities, provide some drainage as well. But, unfortunately, we're witnessing a pattern whereby, as these investments are getting put in place in these communities, the government itself is taking action to demolish the homes of the very people who are the intended beneficiaries of those investments. So, for me, last July, when the government went into Makoko without a lot of warning, just with a 72-hour notice, began to demolish, I was very outraged. And I felt like the purpose of that project was being completely subverted by that action of the government. So in protest against the demolition of Makoko, I resigned from that board and led SaharaTV to, led SaharaTV in protest, on behalf of the community that eventually stopped the demolition. As a matter of fact, just about 30,000 people were eventually demolished, were rather made homeless in Makoko. We still have over 150,000 people who live there, whose fate is still hanging in the balance. We are in court over that matter, trying to get a court injunction to restrain the government from returning to continue that demolition. But to come back to the World Bank angle, yes, we are very dissatisfied with the pattern of I think, what I've called a subversion of the intent and purposes of that project by the very conflicting action of government in destroying the homes of the people who are supposed to benefit from this project. And what is more disturbing is that, quite often the land that is seized, as in the Makoko waterfront, the notice that the government gave to them to quit was very clear. The government's intention was to take the waterfront and hand it over to big developers, people who intend to build boat clubs, waterfront restaurants and hotels, things like that. Now, listen, don't get me wrong. Anyone who lives in Lagos will agree that, the need for, I think, the revamping of infrastructure, the need for economic, development is dire. I agree. Lagos is my favorite city in the world. I want to see a Lagos that looks good, that, works well, that is safe for both, negotiants and visitors alike. I want to see all that. But the question is that the government must find the balance between its declared purpose to clean up Lagos and to bring in, economic investments, with the need to ensure that the populations of these slums, who constitute over 2/3 of the population, are also enabled to live in peace and dignity within the city, side by side with the wealthy. Lagos cannot become the city of the rich, because the poor are in the majority. Like I said, over 2/3 of them live in these communities. So I think that the government really has to go back to the drawing board and figure out a long-term plan that includes the poor. Right now, it does seem as though the poor of Lagos are excluded from whatever plans they're making to build this city that they call a mega city.
Yes, on that note that you mentioned, I'm curious if you feel that there's a belief that somehow the government has taken this idea upon themselves that they can in fact remove the poor, so to speak, from Lagos, that there would be no room for them within the city. I mean, there's still various jobs that people wouldn't do, and supposedly they would go to the poor, or the fact that they still have a right and, like you say, make up the majority of the, in fact, population. And so, I mean, it's kind of confusing how they believe that just by demolishing they can in fact push these people out. I mean, is that what the government's trying to do, or is it that they don't really know and so they're just doing what they believe based off these efforts to sell off the property and commercialization?
No, I think that the problem as I see it is that there's not a whole lot of planning going on. A lot of these actions are not well thought out. They're not well planned. Certainly, whatever plans that they make, do not take advantage of both the local knowledge that's available within these communities, and certainly the processes that they adopt in making those plans are very closed. They're not open enough to enable for the participation of all stakeholders. There are many huge plans that are rolled out in the city, and people like us, I mean, I am very present and I'm very active and I engage, quite vigorously. But sometimes, these things come as a surprise to some of us. So that, we don't know when these plans are developed, and we don't know. So, my point is that quite often the government gets it wrong from the get-go, because they are not planning enough and they're not consulting enough, and they're not enabling, the participation, the involvement of people who ought to be involved as well.
Right. Very briefly, sir, unfortunately we are just a little short on time. Now, you have been at this work, like you mentioned, for quite some time, and that has not been without its cost. If you could just briefly talk about, I know currently you had a bit of a conflict and confrontation with Fashola and some of his members of, I believe, the police or security agencies. If you could just briefly sum that up. I mean, has there been this sort of kickback from the government based on the work that you've been doing?
Well, yes, there was an incident that occurred about the end of April, about April the 26th or so, that involved, it was a traffic incident. My drivers were, I think, wrongly accused of driving against traffic, even though they were ordered to stand in that position by the police, by the same police who were escorting the governor. And in the end, the police ended up beating the drivers and impounded the vehicles and charged the drivers with driving against traffic, which never happened, quite frankly. But the matter is, we've been, there's been a lot of discussions with the government. We did, some statesmen, senior citizens, stepped into the matter and facilitated a peace process, which we have been, working through. And trying to resolve the matter. The vehicles have been released. The drivers have also been released from custody. They spent about 8 days in custody over the Easter period. And but we are very close now to reaching some type of settlement on the matter that will allow for both parties to focus on more important matters of state.
Okay, thank you for that, Felix. Viewers, that has been Felix Morka, founder and executive director of the Social and Economic Rights Action Center of Nigeria. He was with us today to talk about the illegal demolition of communities across Lagos and other parts of Nigeria to make way for the commercialization of these states. Stay tuned, we have a lot more coming up. Thank you.